Welcome back to BYoungMinistry.com, to another blog and to another podcast. Today we continue in our study of the book of Genesis, chapter 13, verses 5 through 13, which reads, Lot also went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. So Abram said to Lot, Please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go toward Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent, even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. That's Genesis chapter 13, verses 5 through 13. Today we return to our study of Genesis chapter 13, which is a chapter characterized by the word new, although it's not used in the chapter. After Abram took his family down to Egypt in search of food, since there was a famine in the promised land, he had now returned to the promised land. Having considered in verses 1 through 4 of this chapter where Abram received from God a new beginning, today we will consider verses 5 through 13, where Abram will receive a new burden. And then in our next study of verses 14 through 18, Abram will get a new blessing. In today's passage, we will see the second of three threats to the promise that God had given to Abram in Genesis chapter 12. In verses 5 through 7 of today's passage, we read, Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. Abram wasn't the only one who had flocks, servants, and property. Lot also owned his fair share. After arriving back in the land promised by God to Abram, it had become obvious that there wasn't enough grass to feed all the animals of both Abram and Lot. As a result, the need for the two families to separate had become quite apparent, since it was causing strife between Abram's people and Lot's people. By mentioning the Canaanites and the Perizzites, God gave us a warning that whenever strife looms between believers, the enemies of the Lord are ready to take full advantage of it. These Canaanites and Perizzites living in the land were clearly representative of the evils of the flesh that lurk in every believer's heart. Things like greed, jealousy, envy, resentment, and bitterness. These expressions of the flesh are always ready to spring into action if there is any division among believers. Abram was very wise to act before these could be awakened, for he knew that they were in the land and they were not about the will of God. In verses 8 and 9 of today's passage, we read, So Abram said to Lot, Please let there be no strife between you and me. in between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. Abram graciously deferred to his nephew Lot by giving him the first pick of the land that he would dwell upon. Since Lot was probably older than Abram, he offered the choice of resolving the matter to Lot. This was big since Abram was the head of the family. Abram's choice merely revealed Abram's faith in the God of the Bible. When we lift ourselves above others, we are really only showing contempt for the God who created us. This is why we are told in Philippians chapter 2 to humble ourselves, to take on lowliness of mind and esteem others as better than ourselves. This is not easy to do, but is the right thing to do. Since God had already promised Abram the land, and Abram was allowing God to define him, this decision was not at all that difficult for Abram to make. So Abram didn't worry about the decision Lot made. Whether he decided to go one way or the other wouldn't really affect what God had already determined for Abram. This is true for each of us. Just as Abram knew that the land would be his, those who trust in the Lord Jesus can rest assured in God's promises and his faithfulness. This is how to deal with strife that we experience with other believers from time to time. In verses 10 and 11 of today's passage, we read, "And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go towards Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other." Lot probably didn't take long in making his decision. He looked toward the plain of the Jordan, where the land was lush and well watered. Unlike the other areas of the land, which were highly dependent on the rain cycle, the plain of the Jordan received water and nutrients from the Jordan as it flowed south. This would be especially true during the flooding season, just like the Nile in Egypt, which Lot would have seen when they were there. Instead of worrying about famines, which sent them to Egypt in the first place, there would be a much better chance of having grass and crops, even when there was no rain. Lot chose the spot where the garden of the Lord was, and the Lord compared it to the land of Egypt. Adam was created and then was placed in the Garden of Eden. When he disobeyed, he was sent east of Eden, and Cain went further east to the land of Nod. After the flood, the same area that Cain went to is where Nimrod went. But God called Abram back to the place where the Garden of Eden was. And this is the same land where God's presence dwelt in the temple and where the Lord Jesus walked. It is also the same place which will look very similar to this period again in the millennial reign of Christ, according to Ezekiel chapter 47. The land of Israel is where all things started, and it is the place where all things will find their completion. No wonder the whole world has and will continue to covet this land and to come against it. There were some things that Lot did not see. Although the Jordan Valley was there before his eyes, he did not see the significance of its name. The word Jordan means death. The river descended out of the living waters of Galilee, dropping far below sea level into the Dead Sea, from which there is no outlet. Outwardly, it was gorgeous to the eyes. Spiritually, it meant the place of death. And this Lot failed to see. In verses 12 and 13 of today's passage, we read, Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. Unfortunately for Lot, he didn't pay attention to the lessons of the past. Mixing with the ungodly is what brought about the flood of Noah. Even though Sodom was quite attractive on the surface, underneath its appearances, it was a place of rebellion against God. Not only did Lot choose such a place, he sank deeper and deeper into its web of deceit as he moved from the outskirts of the city into the city. In the chapters ahead, we're going to see where Lot's wrong choice of moving into the land of Sodom would leave him in very sad straits, and which would even cost him the life of his wife. Lot moved to Sodom and dwelt among those defined by wickedness. He may have maintained his own righteousness, but it affected his life and his family very badly. In the end, Lot chose by sight rather than by faith in the God of the Bible. And sin will always find us out when we allow ourselves to be defined by our flesh. My friends, I trust this blog and this podcast are helping you in your walk with the Lord. If I can be of any further assistance to you in your walk with the Lord, shoot me an email at BYoungMinistry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great